1978, Charles Haughey was Minister for Health in a majority Fianna Fáil government. He introduced a health bill that finally succeeded in legalising contraceptives in Ireland.
The guidelines are laid down for the medical profession. They're asked to restrict the issue of prescriptions to bona fide family planning circumstances or appropriate medical conditions, and they still have preserved, absolutely intact in the bill, their professional, clinical relationship with their patient.
To bring in legislation that was contrary to the Catholic ethos was politically dangerous. It needed astute management. People have always thought that Fianna Fáil were best at handling the Catholic Church and Catholic issues because they had that dexterity, because they knew what was going on in the hearts, minds and souls of Irish Catholics. And so they responded to themselves. Charlie Haughey was perhaps the best placed, having done a whistle-stop tour during the 70s to every common in the country. And so he knew what he could get away with politically.
Before drafting the legislation, Haughey met with all interested parties, including a delegation from the Catholic hierarchy led by Dr. Cathal Daly.
We were there to put our point of view after long and serious deliberation, and our reviews were respectfully listened to, and then we left it to the consciences of politicians and of voters. In Cardinal Conway's time, we adopted a principle which I think has been adhered to faithfully ever since. A twofold principle, that we, in any approach to government, we would carefully discuss our approach in advance, that we would formally state the content, spell out in considerable detail the points we were going to make to government, and secondly, that we would publish the text of that approach, so that there would be no question of a backstairs approach or any kind of secret huddle in which we would privately meet with government ministers and tell them this is what we want. That we rejected completely from what you might call the very beginning of the modern period.
In '79, the bill was passed. Non-medical contraceptives were now legally available in Ireland for the first time, but only under prescription. The bill gave special mention to the benefits of natural family planning, and Haughey made provision for conscientious objectors who refused to have anything to do with contraception.
People are inclined to be very critical of it now, perhaps because of the phrase Irish solution to an Irish problem, but as the French say, it's only the first step that costs a lot, and I think it was a positively brilliant legislative achievement, and you have creative ambiguity of phrases like for bona fide family planning purposes. It conveys the impression that it's just for married people, but doesn't quite say that. And he managed to overcome some internal party opposition to the matter as well, in a way that the supposedly more liberal Fine Gael Labour coalition hadn't succeeded in doing. Despite his reputation, he was very good at consensus building when he put his mind to it.
Well, I thought it was a bit absurd to legislate the contraception available only to married people, because obviously it wasn't going to work. Once they were on sale, people were going to get access to them, and it was an ineffective piece of public relations rather than legislation. And we indeed changed that later on in 1985, I think I was at 6, when we came into power. So it wasn't a bill I didn't enthusiasm for.
They would have accepted that bill as something that had to be done in society. Now, they wouldn't have liked it, but that's beside the point. But a perception went out in that they were willing to accept a bill coming from a Fianna Fáil government and not from a Fine Gael government. Well, that I would not regard as true. That was a perception, we say, maybe in media and commentators and others that would be making it. But that wouldn't be true at all. The old threesome of the GAA, Fianna Fáil and the Catholic Church. But that wasn't true. I mean, there were very serious issues for the Church's teaching, for the Church's understanding of its role and its Church's obligation to teach the gospel. And it had nothing got to do with politics, and never had.
But Haughey got it through the party. A quite cynical move, but it was the most he felt he could do, and he really wasn't interested. He was far more interested in the upcoming prospect in '79 of getting rid of Jack Lynch. That was the real contraceptive that was in the offing.
The result was Charles Haughey, 44, George Colley, 38.
A much less time-consuming.
Reaction to Haughey's legislation was mixed. Some objected to the restrictions imposed in the bill.
The pill bill got a fiery baptism last Saturday. At Trinity College, the contraception campaigners gathered to pour scorn on it. They, and many like them, had asked for free family planning in Ireland since the McGee case 6 years ago.
Creams and spermicides.
The hierarchy responded by warning Catholics, particularly doctors and pharmacists, that cooperation in the prescription, sale or distribution of contraceptives was morally wrong as far as the Catholic Church was concerned.
Haughey accepted that if any chemist didn't want to stock contraceptives, there would be no penalty. There would be no obligation. And if any doctor didn't want to prescribe a prescription, there'd be no obligation on the doctor to do so, even if a patient under GMS, medical card holder, went and said, I want a prescription. Doctor was not obliged to prescribe on a conscience basis.
Yesterday, we went out with a prescription. We chose the Dublin suburb of Ranelagh completely at random. We went to 3 chemist shops. This chemist shop, despite the fact that I've a doctor's prescription for contraceptives, cannot supply them. So we tried a second shop on the street. And this chemist doesn't supply contraceptives either. He says that he has opted out of supplying them under the Act on conscientious grounds. This family planning law just isn't working. Another chemist who says that they don't stock contraceptives and can't fulfill a doctor's prescription.
It was a strange situation in 1979. I mean, you put one side of it, but you could alternatively put the opposite side, where is it fair and just and right to force people or compel people to either stock or sell something with which they totally agree, which they consider to be pernicious and dangerous and damaging? Is it fair? Is it constitutionally even feasible or proper to force people to do something that they don't consider? Surely that's violation of conscience.
Well, you see, there's a debate in terms of to exactly what degree, even from a Catholic point of view, to what degree the civil law and Catholic moral law should coincide. There is actually an attitude within Catholicism, and a centuries-old attitude, that sometimes the perfect can be the enemy of the good. That if you try to have, if you like, a perfect law from a Catholic moral standpoint, you may actually end up overburdening the law and bringing it into disrepute. Because if, for example, you have a law against contraception, and many people are getting contraception anyway over the sort of under the counter and on the QT, you bring the law into complete disrepute and you make a mockery of the law, and by doing so you actually damage the law.
The Pope's visit was at a very interesting time, because the Pope came in September 1979, and it actually was 2 months after the passage of the Family Planning Act, which was in July of 1979. And I think it's just a very interesting juxtaposition there, because essentially that marked the very beginning of the liberalisation of Irish society.
As leader of the opposition, Garrett Fitzgerald was anxious that the government use this extraordinary opportunity to bring certain issues directly to the attention of the new Pope. But he hadn't mentioned this to the Taoiseach.
I'd meant to say to Jack Lynch, I hoped he'd raise the question of mixed marriages, you see. And I'd forgotten to do so. So while we're waiting, because everything was in arrears, I was in a little room with my wife, Joan, and Frank Tusky. This was the opposition, you see. The government were in a larger room, the more of them, and it struck me, perhaps I could get across and just have a word with Jack Lynch, so that if he had a chance, he'd raise this. And I went across and said this to him. So, Garrett, I know we'd hoped to raise it at the Orus, but the visit was so short. Neither Paddy, Hillary and I got a chance to do so. I will if I can. Well, this is all televised, but fortunately it wasn't actually on sound. It was just vision only. But I had no idea I was being televised while communicating as leader of the opposition to the Taoiseach in this way.
What exactly did you want to convey to the Pope?
that it was necessary, we thought, to modify the position of the church in mixed marriages so as to end the situation where the Protestant population was being decimated generation after generation by all the children being brought up in Catholic religion rather than, in some cases, Protestants. That's why.
And you never got to do it?
No, none of us did. But it was interesting. It was a view was shared by all of us, by the President, the Taoiseach, myself. But we never got to saying it, I'm afraid.
Do not be discouraged. Do not follow the trends where a close-knit family is seen as outdated.
He laid out clearly that Ireland was facing now a whole materialistic kind of culture that it hadn't before, and it had to choose its path between the ways of materialism or the things of the spirit. And his message to the people in Galway had a kind of an apocalyptic ring to it, really, when he talked about the moral sickness that stalks your land today, when he was talking to the young people. But in actual fact, the liberalisation of Irish society was well underway by the time the Pope came, and his warnings didn't stop the further liberal developments happening. In actual fact, they accelerated really in the 80s and 90s.
I mean, anyone who was reading the papers or tuned into radio or television, I mean, from the 1960s on, life was changing in Ireland and changing very perceptively. In fact, you could say from television, you know, that's a good enough marking point. And that's why when the Pope came, he did speak once or twice, certainly spoke at Limerick about being at a crossroads and so on. And that's what he meant, that there was a new kind of society, an open society, I would call it, where there were literally no barriers, no protection, against the if you like, just what was happening across the world.
Well, I think the papal visit was, if you like, the last hurrah of Catholicism as the major and predominant cultural, social, moral force in Ireland. At that time, you could still say Ireland was a Catholic country, and that was to some degree indicated by the fact that 1 million people turned out for the papal mass in the Phoenix Park. But I say to some degree because there was still even then a lot of nominalism, and you would have had quite a number of people who were going to mass at a convention who went to the papal mass in '79, and a lot of those people who were going at a convention very quickly stopped going when the conventions began to change. So it was the point at which it sort of, in a way, underline and draw a line in the sand around the idea that once we were massively and hugely a Catholic country, demonstrated by the papal mass, but that was also the, if you like, the last hurrah of that Ireland.
The changes that took place in the 1970s, to my mind, were primarily led by women. They are the linchpin in understanding the erosion of Catholic Ireland. They didn't see themselves as mothers, they didn't see themselves as being confined to the home, they didn't see themselves as being obedient housewives. And so they began to want things that had been denied to them. What they wanted most, of course, was control over their fertility. They wanted to be able to have children when and where they wanted.